Of course, here is the complete English translation of the expanded story, followed by 10 compelling and visually rich prompts suitable for an AI image generator. The English story, Between Iron and a Joke, June 6, 1944, The English Channel. The Higgins landing craft was like the steel stomach of a ravenous beast. Inside it held dozens of young men pressed shoulder to shoulder, building invisible walls with their prayers and their fears, impatient to be vomited onto the bloody shores of Normandy. The air was thick with the smells of diesel fumes, salt, and the sour tang of vomit that rose from the gut. The flat bottom of the boat slammed mercilessly against the waves, turning the simple act of standing into a torture and sitting into an agony. In this claustrophobic metal box, Corporal Jack, Iron Jack Thompson, stood among his squad, trying to savor the last precious minutes before knocking on the gates of hell. Jack didn't wear his fear like armor. He converted it into a joke, a wry smile. He was the squad's unshakable source of levity. Even in the most tense moments, with the cold breath of death on their necks, he managed to crack a joke and shatter the wall of fear, or at least crack it for a moment. It wasn't that he wasn't afraid. On the contrary, he was terrified to his bones, to every cell of his being. But for him, humor was a weapon used to maintain control, a shield to keep from going mad. He winked at Private Miller, an 18-year-old kid sitting beside him, his face as white as chalk. The boy's hands were trembling on his M1 rifle. "Hey, Miller, relax." Jack's voice was vibrant, cutting through the engine roar. "You know the difference between this beach and a pretty girl? I have no idea. I'm seeing them both for the first time, and they're both probably going to kill me." A tense, strangled laugh escaped from a few other soldiers. It was a momentary relief, like the final silence before a storm, but it was something. This was Jack's method. He fed the relentless beast of his own fear by giving morale to others, silencing it with his own noise. He felt the small, hard bulge in his breast pocket, the photograph of his fiancée, Mary, which she had sent wrapped in a waterproof pouch, its edges worn with prayers and hope. He closed his eyes for a second and pulled himself out of that metal coffin. His mind drifted to the park in Ohio last summer, the smell of freshly cut grass, the sound of Mary's laughter, the warmth of her hand in his. "Take care of yourself, Jack," she had said. "Promise me you'll come back." And Jack, with the foolish invincibility of youth and love, had replied, "I promise. It's just a little trip." That promise was his greatest motivation. But now, the weight of that promise felt heavier than the 80 pounds of gear on his back. "Get ready for the ramp!" The sergeant's command cracked like a whip. Everyone fell silent. The jokes were over. The smile on Jack's face froze. With a screech of iron and the rattle of chains, the famous ramp began to lower, slow and unstoppable like the blade of a guillotine. It opened like the gates of hell. A joke was on Jack Thompson's lips, as always, but he swallowed it. Because waiting for them on the other side weren't soldiers in trenches, but death itself, pure and absolute, made of metal and fire. The infamous fabric-ripping sound of the machine guns, the hellish buzzsaw of the MG-42s drowned out all other noise. Before the ramp was even fully down, the first row of soldiers collapsed backwards onto them, lifeless piles of flesh. He understood in that moment that only one person had to survive this beach: himself. And this battle was not between his squad or his army, but between himself and death. A mortar shell hit the boat, and the world went white for Jack. A deafening explosion, and he was thrown through the air like a rag doll. When he opened his eyes, he was in the icy, blood-red waters of the English Channel. His lungs, filled with salt water, were trying to swallow him. The world was a symphony of chaos, burning boats, bodies flailing in the water, cries for help, and the sinister whine of bullets that he could hear even underwater. His heavy gear was pulling him down mercilessly like an anchor. Panic seized his throat like a vice. He made his first and most brutal decision of the lore. To survive, he had to cut away his precious ammunition, his pack, everything that made him a soldier, with his knife. His life was more important than his ammo. In that moment, at the bottom of the sea, he was not a soldier, but simply a human being fighting to live. When he reached the shore, he realized the water was no safer than the fire. Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse. German machine guns were mowing the sand like a scythe, turning human bodies into lifeless heaps on the sand. The waves crashing on the shore were crimson. But this was only the beginning of the horror Jack would experience that day. He threw himself onto the sand, his lungs burning. Bullets whizzing past him created little puffs of dust in the sand. He was utterly alone. His squad was gone. His only cover was the rusted metal obstacles called check hedgehogs and the lifeless bodies of his comrades who had been hit seconds before him. He crawled from one body to another, inch by painful inch. He was like a worm in hell. The Joker inside him tried to resist one last time. "Great resort," he whispered to himself. "The view is a bit crowded." But the joke was still born on his lips. It wasn't funny. Nothing was funny. As he caught his breath behind a check hedgehog, he saw a familiar face. It was the young Private Miller, the one with the trembling hands. His eyes were staring blankly at the gray, indifferent sky. His uniform was soaked in blood. Jack crawled towards him in denial. Maybe he was alive. Maybe he was just wounded. When he reached him, he touched his neck. There was no pulse. Miller was gone. In that moment, when the man of steel, the man who made jokes in the face of terror, came face to face with the lifeless body of the boy he had just tried to make laugh, his cheerful mask shattered into 1,000 pieces. The pure primal fear he had suppressed his whole life erupted to the surface like a volcano. His eyes filled with tears. It was just for a moment, but in that moment, Jack Thompson died, and in his place was left only a heap of flesh and bone trying to survive. But he had no time to cry, because a sound he heard at that very moment, would change everything. With the weapon and ammunition, he threw himself into the crater where the cry had come from. A few other wounded soldiers were there. All their eyes were fixed on the German machine gun nest on the hill that controlled the beach. Until that nest was silenced, no one had a chance of getting off this beach alive. Jack knew what he had to do. He set up the machine gun on the edge of the crater. He checked the mechanism, fed the ammo belt. He took a deep breath. He fixed his gaze on the nest. This was the turning point of his life. The man who was deathly afraid of dying, the man who hid his fear behind jokes, was now going to deliberately draw all of hell's attention, all of its fire, upon himself. He was going to make himself the target so that other soldiers could advance, so they could live. He pulled the trigger. The deep, powerful roar of the Browning was like an answer to the high-pitched shriek of the MG-42. His bullets hammered the concrete and sandbags around the German position. Instantly, as he had expected, the German MG-42 turned on him, concentrating all its fire on Jack's crater. Bullets were passing inches over his head, tearing apart the edges of the crater, throwing sand and dirt in his face. Jack kept firing. This was his last joke against his fear, his most deadly punchline. The few seconds of pressure and distraction he created were enough for a group of soldiers further down the beach. The soldiers burst from behind their cover and began running towards the nest with grenades. As Jack fired one last burst to support their advance, he felt a sharp, burning pain in his shoulder. A bullet had found him. He fell back with a cry of pain, but at that exact moment, the grenades thrown by the advancing soldiers exploded one after another in the German nest, and that sinister, death-spitting machine gun fell silent. Jack lay wounded in the crater. He had done his job. He hadn't changed the course of the war, perhaps, but in that moment, in that small sector, he had saved a few lives. More importantly, he had defeated the greatest enemy within himself, his fear. A medic came running and began to attend to Jack's wound. "Hang on, soldier, we're getting you out of here," he said. A bloody but genuine smile appeared on Jack's lips. "Don't rush, pal," he said, breathing with difficulty. "The view isn't so bad. The service is just a little slow." In that moment, Jack Thompson, known for his jokes, had truly become Iron Jack. His humor was no longer a shield hiding his fear, but a medal earned with blood and iron of a soul that had passed through that fear and survived. As he was carried away on a stretcher, he noticed that the waves crashing on the beach were a little less red now. He closed his eyes and squeezed the photograph of Mary in his pocket. He had kept his promise. He was alive.